Benny Hill was the most successful comedian the world has ever known. He was the lad from Southampton who did the rounds of the music halls and working men's clubs, doing the jokes.
Benny Hill was a certified genius, praised by entertainment legends for his incredible comedic timing. His show was a ratings juggernaut, a cultural export that made the world laugh. But not all things are what they seem. A single scene, just a few minutes of airtime, would unravel everything. This one sketch was so inflammatory that it didn't just cause a controversy, it triggered a moral panic that ultimately led to the show being wiped from television schedules seemingly forever. The story behind this one scene is absolutely shocking, and we have all the details. When a milkman conquered television. The show's formula was a masterclass in controlled chaos. Every episode was a whirlwind of short sketches, song parodies, and unforgettable characters. There was Fred Scuttle, the bumbling incompetent with his signature salute, and the recurring bit with the short, bald Jackie Wright, whose head Hill would pat in rapid succession, a simple gag that became a fan favorite. But the thing nobody tells you is how meticulously crafted this chaos was. Hill was a perfectionist, involved in every aspect of the show from writing to editing. Of course, the most iconic part of the show was the final chase scene. Set to the frantic, unforgettable tune of yakety sax, Hill would be pursued by a motley crew of characters, police officers, vicars, and most famously, a group of scantily clad women. The film was sped up, creating a silent movie feel that was universally hilarious. This ending became so famous that yakety sax is now cultural shorthand for any foolish, chaotic pursuit. It was pure, unadulterated fun, and audiences couldn't get enough. In the 1980s, he added Hill's Angels, a troupe of dancers who performed elaborate routines, adding a touch of glamour to the silliness. What many overlooked is that the man behind this comedy empire came from the humblest of beginnings. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born in Southampton, England in the mid-1920s. Showbiz was in his blood. His grandfather was a circus clown, but his own path was far less direct. Before comedy, he worked as a milkman, a bridge operator, a drummer, and even a driver. These ordinary jobs gave him a priceless education in observing human behavior, a skill that would later define his comedy. The Second World War changed everything. He served as a mechanic and searchlight operator, but his true calling was found in the combined services entertainment, performing for troops who desperately needed a laugh. It was there he learned that comedy wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline. After the war, he adopted the stage name Benny in honor of his favorite comedian, the American radio star Jack Benny. He made his television debut with the BBC in 1955, and the rest is history. His unique blend of British music hall tradition and fast-paced television editing was revolutionary. When he moved to Thames Television in 1969, the show's budget and ambition grew, solidifying its place as a global export. Legends of comedy revered him. Charlie Chaplin, the master of silent film, reportedly had an entire collection of Hill's work. The thing is, Benny Hill wasn't just a clown. He was a genius who had perfected a universal language of laughter. But a new decade was dawning, and the world was changing faster than anyone could have predicted. The joke that went too far. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, a cultural shift was underway in Britain. What was once considered cheeky fun was beginning to be seen through a different lens. For years, quiet criticisms had simmered beneath the surface of Benny Hill's success. Voices from feminist groups and media critics argued that his comedy, particularly the endless chase scenes featuring women in revealing outfits, was outdated and treated women as mere props for a joke. For a long time, these criticisms were dismissed by his massive fan base, who saw the show as harmless, seaside postcard fun. But then came one specific sketch, a scene that was so poorly judged it couldn't be ignored. This was the moment that turned whispers of disapproval into a roar of public outrage. The scene in question was framed as a parody of a beauty pageant, a format ripe for comedic exaggeration. Benny, playing a leering and overly enthusiastic host, introduced a lineup of contestants. The women walked across the stage, their bodies on full display, while the camera lingered in a way that felt more invasive than funny. They weren't characters with personalities or lines, they were simply there to be looked at, their presence a setup for the punchline. This kind of setup had been a staple of the show for years, but this time something was different. The tone felt off, the jokes cruder. To put it mildly, the punchline of the sketch was so tasteless that for many it stripped away the veneer of harmless fun and left something uncomfortable and embarrassing in its place. What made this sketch the final straw? You see, it served as the perfect, undeniable evidence for every single criticism that had been leveled against Hill for years. Critics no longer had to speak in generalities about the show's tone. They could point to this one specific scene and say, "See, this is what we're talking about." It was the smoking gun. For a younger generation of viewers who were being raised on a new, smarter brand of comedy, the sketch wasn't just unfunny, it felt like a relic from a bygone era. It was cringe-worthy. The backlash was swift and brutal. Newspapers, which had once celebrated Hill as a national treasure, were now running columns questioning whether his brand of humor had a place in modern television. Broadcasting regulators were flooded with complaints. What many overlooked was that the ground had shifted beneath Hill's feet. The world had changed, but his comedy hadn't. The very things that had made him famous, the cheeky innuendo and the slapstick objectification, were now seen as his greatest sins. This wasn't just a bad review, it was a cultural reckoning. The scene became a symbol of everything wrong with the show, a lightning rod for 2 decades of pin-up frustration. The laughter was fading, replaced by a growing chorus of condemnation. The king of comedy was about to find himself on trial in the court of public opinion. When the critics came calling, the charge against Benny Hill was led by a new generation of performers known as alternative comedians. These were comics who rejected the old-school, gag-based style of entertainers like Hill. Their humor was sharp, political, and aggressive. The most vocal of these critics was a young, fiery comedian named Ben Elton, a co-writer of the hit show The Young Ones. Elton didn't just dislike Hill's comedy, he saw it as genuinely harmful. He publicly accused the Benny Hill Show of promoting a culture that disrespected women, arguing that the endless parade of leering old men chasing after young women was not just unfunny, but dangerous. Elton's comments were explosive and ignited a fierce national debate. For many, it felt like a long overdue truth was finally being spoken. But for Hill's loyal fans and many in the entertainment industry, it was an unfair attack. They argued that connecting silly, harmless sketches to real-world harm was absurd. One journalist famously mocked Elton's position by saying it was like blaming pianists for the poaching of elephants. Hill's defenders saw him not as a menace, but as a master of a classic comedic form, a tradition that stretched back to the days of music hall and vaudeville. They insisted it was all just a bit of fun and that critics were deliberately missing the point to score political points. But the thing is, the controversy was piling up on top of other, more practical problems. Behind the scenes, the show was becoming a massive financial burden for Thames Television. By the late 1980s, each one-hour special cost around £450,000 to produce. That's the equivalent of over £1.4 million, or about $1.7 million in today's money. It was one of the most expensive light entertainment shows on television. For years, the high cost was justified by the incredible ratings and international sales. But now, the domestic ratings in the UK were starting to slide. You see, while the show remained a massive hit overseas, something strange was happening back home. The British audience, the one that had made it a phenomenon, was quietly slipping away. Younger viewers weren't tuning in anymore. They'd moved on to newer, edgier shows that spoke their language. The loyal fans who had stuck around since the early days were getting older and their numbers were thinning. What was once the crown jewel of British television was now looking more like an aging relic. Behind the scenes, the executives at Thames Television were facing an impossible dilemma. They were pouring money into a show that was costing more than ever to produce, yet delivering less and less in return. And worse than that, it had become a magnet for controversy. Newspapers were tearing it apart, calling it outdated, tasteless, even cruel. Every joke was suddenly being analyzed, every line criticized. The same humor that had once been celebrated as bold and clever was now being labeled offensive. For the people running the network, it was a nightmare. The Broadcasting Standards Council had begun sniffing around. Regulators were demanding explanations, and the media smelled blood. Inside Tams itself, tension was rising. Some executives wanted to double down and defend the show, insisting it was still part of the national culture. Others wanted to pull the plug before the damage got worse. No one could agree on what to do next. A decision had to be made, and it would bring an entire era of television to a shocking end. What really happened after the show was canceled? In 1989, after 20 years with Thames Television, the axe finally fell. The network announced that The Benny Hill Show was being canceled. There was no grand farewell tour or celebratory final episode. One of the most successful television programs in British history was simply taken off the air. The official reason given was the declining ratings and high production costs, but for those on the inside, this was merely a smokescreen. The relentless controversy had sealed its fate, but the story is far darker than a simple case of changing public tastes. Wild theories persist to this day that Hill's cancellation wasn't a natural decline, but a calculated cultural execution. Whispers in the halls of the BBC and Thames Television spoke of a new wave of alternative comedians who saw Hill's old-school slapstick as a roadblock to their own progressive, politically charged brand of humor. Was Benny Hill simply outdated, or was he actively pushed out? Some suggest he became a symbolic target, a sacrifice made to appease powerful feminist lobby groups and political figures who wanted to sanitize Britain's cultural image. By painting him as a relic of a bygone, horrible era, the new guard could effectively seize control of the comedic landscape. The declining ratings, they argue, were a self-fulfilling prophecy, engineered by scheduling his show at odd hours and slashing its promotional budget. The mystery only deepens when you contrast the larger-than-life character on screen with the man himself. Benny Hill had amassed a fortune estimated to be worth over £7 million, a colossal sum for the time. Yet he lived an almost unbelievably frugal life. He never bought his own home, preferring to live in a small rented apartment in a suburb of London. He didn't own a car, choosing to walk everywhere instead. Stories abound of him walking miles to the BBC studios and gluing the soles of his old shoes back together to save a few pence. Was this simple thriftiness or a symptom of a deep-seated paranoia rooted in his impoverished upbringing? Some have theorized his extreme penny-pinching was a psychological disorder, a constant fear that his fame and fortune were illusions that could vanish at any moment. He was a deeply private and lonely man. He never married and had few close friends. The man who brought joy to millions seemed to have very little for himself. In his final years, his health began to fail. In February 1992, he suffered a heart attack. Doctors recommended a heart bypass, major surgery that could have saved his life, but he flatly refused. Why? The official story is that he was scared, but another theory posits that he had simply given up. After being publicly shamed and professionally exiled, perhaps he saw no future worth fighting for. Just a couple of months later, on April 20th, 1992, Benny Hill was found in his armchair, having passed away alone from a coronary thrombosis. His body reportedly lay undiscovered for 2 days. In a tragic twist of fate that feels scripted, a new lucrative contract from an American television company had been pushed through his mail slot. It was an offer to bring his show back, a chance at redemption. It had arrived too late. Or had it? The wildest theory of all questions the timing. Could his extreme isolation have been encouraged by those who knew they stood to inherit his vast fortune? With millions of pounds on the table, a lonely sick man refusing medical care becomes a ticking clock. So when people talk about the one scene that got the show banned, are we missing the key details? The truth is, the show was never officially banned. It was canceled, but the forces behind that cancellation remain debated. That one beauty pageant sketch wasn't the cause, but a symptom, or perhaps the perfect weapon used by his rivals. So, was Benny Hill a comedy dinosaur who deserved to be canceled, or a genius destroyed by a changing world? Let us know below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.